Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of React Native Radio. This week on our panel, we have James Brenton. You're new, so do you want to just give us a brief introduction, who you are, where you're from, why you're famous?
Yeah, sure. My name's James. I'm a software engineer from Leeds in the UK. I'm currently working on projects with Europe's largest entertainment company, and their code base is predominantly JavaScript with React. And when I'm not doing that, I like to write apps using React Native because apps are cool, as we all know.
Nice. We also have Tim Jung.
Hey guys, it's me again.
We also have another new panelist, Romero.
Hey everybody.
Do you want to give us an intro for you too?
Yeah, I actually work at Activision Blizzard on the Call of Duty companion app. Me and Tim are actually on the same team.
Oh, good deal. I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Quick shout outs about a couple things. JS Remote Conf will be in the middle of May. I believe this will come out before then, so go check that out if you want to level up your JavaScript. And then I'm also putting on a React Native remote conference, and that will be in July. If you were looking at Chain React in Portland and you were thinking you might want to go to that, well, now you can virtually go to a conference sort of like it for half the cost, I guess. No travel, and We'll not get anyone sick by doing that. So yeah, those virtual handshakes don't spread germs. So there you go. We have a special guest this week, and that is Jacob Eiting. Jacob, do you want to just introduce yourself and let people know who you are?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jacob. I'm the CEO, the underprepared, undertrained CEO of a company called Revenue Cat. In my past, I was a iOS developer, then an Android developer, then some React Native developer, and then launched this company called Revenue Cat that helps developers handle in-app subscriptions on iOS, Android, React Native, anything you can think of. I came to spend a lot of time with React Native when we were building our SDK for Revenue Cat. But then before that, I had actually done some consulting, convinced some companies to use React Native, and had helped some other people. So, I've got a little bit of experience with the platform and kind of some of the ins and outs and the pros and cons. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
Early in my career, I figured out which jobs were worth working at and which ones weren't, mostly by trial and error. I created a system that I used to find jobs and later contracts as a freelancer. If you're looking for a job or trying to figure out where you should go next, then check out my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. The book walks you through figuring out what you want, vetting companies that meet your criteria, meeting that company's employees, and getting them to recommend you for a job. Don't settle for whoever has listed their job on the job board. Go out and proactively find the job you'll love. Buy the book at devchat.tv/jobbook. That's devchat.tv/jobbook. Awesome. Now, one thing that I'm kind of curious, just to get the conversation rolling, and we did an episode on iFreaks, and we talked a bit about subscriptions and things like that. I'm curious as we dive into this, what are kind of the basics of subscriptions and purchases and things like that, and what does that look like for React Native?
Yeah, so I think the big challenge with React Native, going back to how in-app purchases work, right? I'm not talking about, you're buying your Airbnb or paying for an Airbnb on your app. I'm talking about things like in-app access to content, in-app items if you're doing a game or something like this. And Apple and Google and Amazon and pretty much any app platform requires that you use their on-platform purchase SDKs, which are usually part of the core frameworks. The problem is like since they don't have to compete with anybody, they've kind of just given you what they've given you. And as far as like building some of the more sophisticated things that I think most monetizing apps need, they've kind of like half finished the job. Especially when it comes to subscriptions, it gets even harder when you start adding renewals and all this other stuff. So this was a problem we really identified at my last company, this last company called Elevate. We were a subscription app and ran into all these issues, and that's kind of why we started Revenue Cat. But I think as it pertains to React Native, it becomes even more of a pain because say you want to make a React Native app and you want to sell it on Android or put it on Android and iOS. It's kind of the dream, right? It's like build once, run everywhere. If you want to provide the same purchasing experience in both, you've got to integrate separately with both of these purchasing frameworks. You have to find a way to productize your product in the same way, because like they have slightly different rules. It's maybe a little bit easier if you're not doing subscriptions. If you're doing subscriptions, there's even more like different caveats and things like that. And so you have to, find some framework or some way to like bring those together. And so, yeah, I mean, that's, I think one of the big challenges, especially for React Native developers, I think.
So, are the purchases cross-platform?
Yeah, I mean, that's ideally, right? Like you would love if somebody logs in on their Android device and then purchases, and then they have the app on their iPad and it just works, right? That's the dream. And that's something Revenue Cat will provide, but I think for most developers that's kind of a tall order, because okay, there are some good open source React Native purchase libraries out there, but most of them don't have a server or anything. So if you want to do any sort of that synchronization, when you're doing single platform, you actually get some of that synchronization for free. So on iOS, as long as you're logged into on your iPad and your iPhone the same App Store account, the receipts will sync and you'll get some level of syncing between them. But yeah, if you're trying to do multi-platform, forget it. It's just not going to work, right? Or provide it on the web or something like that. So then you have to build your own server. And now the work is, I like to say more than doubled. So, if you're just supporting iOS subscriptions or just Android subscriptions, doing both together and making them coexist is more than 2 times the work, because there's all sorts of like merging work you have to do to figure out like, okay, what does this mean? And this, like, what's the abstraction layer I can put on top of this? And that becomes, I mean, I feel like that's a problem for React Native in general, right? It's like finding and it's kind of, I think one of the criticisms of React Native, it's like you kind of sometimes end up with the least common denominator between multiple platforms, right? And I think that's kind of true in some cases on the purchasing side, but actually I think you can achieve pretty much full like platform native, behavior if you do it right.
That's cool.
So on this topic, just to build on that a little bit more, can you elaborate on how different Android subscriptions are versus iOS subscriptions? Like, are there a lot of little nitty gritty like details between them, or are there a lot of things that they line up on and are kind of the same on?
Yeah, it's like one of those things where it's just enough to trick you into thinking like it's going to be easy or it's going to be about the same. And then like devil's in the details, right? I mean, at a high level, yeah, it's the same idea, right? Like there's a platform SDK or a platform framework that's tied to their either Google Play or App Store account. Like those things are the same in the sense that, when you go through that actual flow, that's controlled by the operating system. That's the same on both platforms, right? You get that Google Play pop-up or you get that App Store pop-up, right? And that's outside of your app. And so in that sense, there are a lot of things that you can, as a React Native developer, you can kind of rely on being similar, right? And I would actually say like the whole, more or less like the in-app flow is pretty close, that for building a React Native app, you're not going to have to make too many like if Android, else iOS kind of situations. But I think the more nitty gritty comes in those back-end details, right? So both of these systems rely on this concept of a receipt or a token. So you make this purchase, the user goes through this thing, Apple or Google delivers your app a token or a receipt file. It's kind of the same thing. And then you use that as your source of truth for what this user has purchased, right? And in an ideal world, you're independently verifying that with Apple or Google to like check it, right? So the flow is usually user purchases, your app gets the token, you send the token to your backend sends the token to Apple or Google in a third, out of band, and then they return and say, yes, this is valid, here are all the details, and then you go back to your app, right? And so the details of those tokens and differences is actually quite big. So like the Google token will only give you the current transaction. Meanwhile, the Apple token will give you all of the transactions. So like I see a lot of cases where people start with an Apple implementation. They're like, oh, and they just assume like one post will get them all the transactions, and they switch to Android and they're like, okay, wow, that broke already, right? So now I have to rethink my system. So yeah, it's deceptively similar, but then as you like zoom in, it's sort of like fractal in the differences as you get closer and closer. And then they've done stuff like, oh man, yeah. Now I'm thinking about it. There's even just like, okay, so they both have this concept of, and they've been like fast following each other. Google and Apple have been like copying each other. Like Google comes out with something, Apple copies it. Apple comes out with something, Google copies it. And so, but then they like, they do it like slightly differently, right? So you end up with just these like systems that like look the same. And for us at Revenue Cat to like try and build abstractions that are like applicable on both has been really challenging, right? And we end up in a lot of cases where we end up favoring one platform over the other, and then maybe we ended up doing a poor abstraction on one versus the other. So yeah, I mean, I think it's in general a tricky problem. I mean, I think that's in some ways though, the benefit of React Native, right, is that these abstractions get handled by systems programmers, by people building tools, right? And then application developers can just focus on their like core, their core value prop, and like some of the stuff is abstracted away. So it's a very long answer to yes, they're different.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind here is that a lot of times this is or sometimes the only revenue source for a business. And a lot of times too, if I'm just an indie developer, like if I have a whole team of people, it seems like I might be able to just say, look, however long it takes, whatever it takes, right, figure this stuff out. But if I'm an indie guy, I build my own app, and I just want some money to come in, navigating this is somewhat tricky. And then knowing how to set up my pricing and, how to present it so people will buy it and things like that. How do you work all that stuff into your app, right? So that people are more likely to make a purchase, and, I make it easy for them to see the value so that I can get paid.
Yeah. I mean, I think that should be a whole industry, right? Of people like talking about, not just there's the plumbing, which is what we focus on or what I'm best at. And then there's like the parts that I actually think are in a lot of ways, there's stuff you can look at across the ecosystem and say like, okay, what I always tell people is the easiest thing is just copy an app that is doing it well, right? Just like not copy literally, but like look at an app that you respect, look one that you like, and then just kind of be like, okay, let's start there, because they've probably thought about it. They've probably got some data. So I mean, I don't know. It's a dirty secret in product development, I think, in most sectors, is that, you don't need to invent something, don't.
That's true. A lot of the pricing and UX is just out there for people to see, right?
Yeah. And like, there's only so many ways you can do a pricing page, right? I mean, I think you always want to, they talk about the upsell, right? Or the value prop, right? When you price something, I know this is true in SaaS, and I think it's true in mobile as well. It's like you always want to price something based on the value it provides and not necessarily the cost. And this is actually something I see in indies get wrong a lot, is that they way underprice stuff because they're thinking about their costs in some ways, and then because they also discount the cost of their own labor. So like, and they'll be like, oh, $299 a year for my thing. And I'm like, that's never going to make you enough money to make it worth it, man. Like, and it's somewhat overcoming imposter syndrome and also, I guess it depends on what you're building, right? So maybe you don't want it to be a big thing. So maybe $299 is all you ever want to charge. But yeah, you always want to be thinking about like, what's the actual value I'm providing to this end consumer, and then price according to that, right? So like, I'm thinking of a good example. But I don't know. Let's say your service is some sort of fancy calendar, right? That allows them to not hire an assistant, right? And so let's say an assistant for 2 hours a week is $100, right? So, you might be able to charge, $500 a month for that thing or something like this, right? And that's probably way more than you thought it was worth, right? I'm not saying that you can get $500 a month for an app, right? But if your app's really great and it actually does provide that much value, you might be able to charge that much, right?
Or if it saves them $500 a month and you charge $100 or $50,
then you've got leverage, right? Then you've got this huge multiple that you're like, look, I'm worth 500. I'm like, that's kind of an old, it's like kind of an old,
it's an old marketing
Yeah. Look at all this stuff. You get the ShamWow, you get the ShamWow cleaning sauce. You get like all this stuff for a $600 value for $19.99, right?
Yep.
That stuff does work.
Yeah. But that's also, again, if it saves them $500 a month to use your app, I mean, most app developers, most companies aren't thinking that way. So,
yeah,
especially indie folks, because like you said, a lot of us with my stuff, I tend to undervalue what I'm actually selling.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, I did the same at Revenue Cat. Right? I had a really hard time. Like the first time somebody paid us more than like $100 a month, I was like, like, are you sure?
Yeah, I know that you went through 3 different business models for your Revenue Cat, right? What was I know you started. There was I was reading about it. You went through so many different changes. I know you didn't have a free tier in the beginning, and then now you do, just because some app companies weren't making that much revenue, and you kind of felt like you couldn't. It felt a little wrong taking money from them, or
yeah. I mean, that's a whole lesson in going slow at the beginning, right? Starting small, because we didn't have very many customers. I could easily change the pricing and not upset anybody or confuse too many people. But yeah, initially we started and said like, hey, give us 3.5% of your revenue, which I thought was like fair. Cause like in my head, I also had like scales of number of customers we would have in my head kind of off, right? I was like, 1,000 customers, I'll be paying my rent or whatever, you know what I mean? Yeah, it turns out a lot of developers, that's a big take, and especially as like a company gets bigger, when they're saying like, I think for an indie, it's kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, whatever. Or like 3.5%, I can manage that, because you're only maybe making a few $1,000s, so it doesn't add up to all that much. When big companies are making hundreds of thousands of dollars and they're seeing this like 3% just grow and grow and grow, right? Like everybody's like, that's way too expensive.
And at some point that 3% is, that's a person's salary. I'm just going to pay somebody to figure that out. And then I'm getting that worker for free.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's always the tension with especially with pricing SaaS products, right? It's like you want to be expensive enough that it's like worth it for you to support this team and this customer. But like, if you get too expensive, suddenly you're like the CFO takes notice and is like, all right, let's get this off the P&L. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so that was hard. I could not close very many customers that way. And so somebody gave me the advice like, hey, just give it away for free for anybody less than $10,000. And that sounded insane to me. Like anybody making less than $10,000 a month, just give it away. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm not going to do that. Right. That's crazy. And eventually like it got through my thick skull. And the reason it's good is like, if you look at like the amount of revenue it takes to build like a really significant large company, you would need the economics of taking 3% of a bunch of people making less than $10,000 a month is really difficult to build something really big with it's like small change, right? And so like, there's almost no difference between taking that money and not taking that money, right? So I was like, okay. And then the benefit is that indie developers or basically anybody who has like a basic need can use the product, can learn the product, can give us feedback, can find bugs, can tell their friends, can take it to their work, right? So they use it for their side project and then they bring it to their office. And that's worked fantastically, right? For us. And it also gives, even developers at a big company, it gives them the ability to kind of like plug it in and try it and then later sell it up to their bosses, right? Because they're like, oh, it's free, right? And then, by the time like they start making a lot of money and it's like a cost item, it's like, well, it's already in there and it works pretty well, right? That's terrible. Nobody don't cut that. but that is like kind of a true thing. It's like, it's easier. The easier it is to get started. I think that's true for most apps. Like I think most apps really, from a user experience perspective, you should really focus on like, how do I make it as simple as possible for my user to get the like atomic unit of usefulness out of this, right? I want to make it free to do that. I want to make it easy to do that, right? And then once you've like proven that like basic function, then you can like work on monetization later, right? I think that's something that can carry from the business to business to the SaaS world a little bit, or sorry, from the SaaS world to the app world a little bit at least.
So on the subject of how you're kind of supporting the people using your product and what things you should focus on, I think it's really cool. And to kind of bring it back to React Native a little bit, is that you have all these different SDKs. You actually have like a pretty diverse set of them. You have obviously your iOS, Android, you have React Native, Flutter, Cordova, Unity, and then something called Catalyst as well, which I'm not familiar with. Obviously, it makes sense to focus a lot of your time on the iOS and Android SDK. But what I tend to notice with a lot of, services or things that exist in the React Native ecosystem is a lot of the time, these things won't really go out of their way to support React Native too much. So at what point do you make the decision to start supporting React Native, and how much resources do you put into that effort?
So for an SDK company, I mean, for us, React Native was the first thing I built after the first two native SDKs. And that was actually, when was that? That was before we got into the Startup Accelerator, before everything. It was like, I had this Android SDK, I had this iOS SDK, and I was like, well, now I just need some JavaScript to glue them together. And what actually happened was I had, in the early days of when you're building an SDK, you're just like, I will do anything for anybody to let me put this thing in their app. So like, I had somebody come to me who was like, hey, I'm working on a React Native app. Can you help? And I was like, yes. And so I like quick rushed and built the React Native version. So I don't know if that probably is not a story that works for most other companies doing the React Native side. But I will say, like, yes, there's this problem, and I see it in the React Native ecosystem. And I see why it happens at our company, which is that inevitably the lion's share still of the market, of our user market share is still native iOS. I'd have to see if I actually wonder if maybe native Android and React Native are probably similar. I don't have good stats on this actually in our, but I think like we have roughly the same number of native Android and React Native folks on our platform. But inevitably it becomes, just because of the fact that the React Native SDK is a dependency of the native SDKs, the native SDKs get the most focus. And then once that, it just by the nature of time, React Native kind of has to be an afterthought, right? Because we have to build features for the native SDKs, and then we have to bring them together on React Native. And until recently, when we were more resource constrained, it was like React Native SDK would just inevitably fall behind. And then we would have to like update it later. I think, but for us, I'll say that the fact that we focus on React Native early, we got our SDK up there. We kind of became, I'm not sure if there are probably other options now, but when we first launched, we were kind of the only React Native purchases SDK that focused on subscriptions at least. And we kind of now own that SEO. So if you're you search React Native in-app subscriptions, like we'll come up really high. And that's been a huge driver of traffic and leads for us. And yeah, I mean, as you said, we have a ton of SDKs because in my mind, most of our work is on those native those native modules and the back end to support these different receipt and different subscription systems. So bringing those together with JavaScript or Flutter or whatever we're using and kind of like building just this like API on top is actually pretty cheap. That said, it's not free. So like it does take us time to go between like, I can't even probably name them all. But yeah, we have React Native, Cordova, Flutter, Unity. I think those are our big cross-platform ones. And then Catalyst is actually the thing that lets you run iOS apps on Mac. So, and it's like got some slight changes, slight differences that we have to account for in our SDK. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's one of these things that it's going to basically be is going to index on how strong and how much demand there is in React Native, right? And so I think as React Native continues to grow, support will become more of a thing that SDK developers have to do. But I don't know. I mean, I think there's what's the one company that does a really good map SDK? Is it Mapbox? There's a Mapbox does a really good React Native SDK. And I think I don't have stats on it, but I'm sure being the de facto SDK on React Native, even if right now it's not the biggest market, if you're a new platform or a new service, if you can become the de facto for React Native, I think there's lots of opportunities, right? And if you assume that React Native continues to grow, you're going to just grow along with that, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a bit of a bet. It's a bit of a gamble. But for startups, I think it's definitely like a place worth supporting. And once you figure out all the like specifics of supporting React Native, building a React Native framework, it's actually not too much work. It's usually like you build a new feature and then like maybe another day or two to get it like ready to go on React Native. You just have to be disciplined about making sure you get those React Native updates out like within a few days, right? And not let it sit, which is probably what you see a lot of, I would guess. People kind of, let that stuff get a little old,
When I'm building a new product, G2I is the company that I call to help me find a developer who can build it. G2I is a hiring platform run by engineers that matches you with React, React Native, GraphQL, and mobile developers that you can trust. Whether you are a new company building your first product or an established company that wants additional engineering help, G2I has the talent you need to accomplish your goals. Go to g2i.co to learn more about what G2I has to offer. In my experience, G2I has linked me up with experienced engineers that can fit my budget. And the G2I staff are friendly and easy to work with. They know how product development works and can help you find the perfect engineer for your stack. Go to g2i.co to learn more about G2I.
Have you seen support for React Native grow since you've been working on this?
Anecdotally, yes. So I don't have hard data on it, but we have a ton of apps that I think in some ways Flutter has kind of squeezed some of the React Native
yeah,
space.
for sure. I was going to ask.
Yeah, and we were quick to jump on Flutter as well. I actually haven't written a single line of Flutter, so I don't know what that feels like. But I have written quite a bit of the React Native side, and yeah, we still have React Native apps coming in every day. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, I'm sure you all have talked about this on your show, but it's like every 3 months, like people are ready to dance on React Native's grave, and it's like it's not even dead, right? It's actually growing, right? But everybody's got this like I don't know. It's just, and I'll be the first one to throw the entire iOS community under the bus, but I think there's this weird like Schadenfreude in the iOS community that nobody can build apps that aren't native iOS, right? And if you can, it's like, I spent all this time learning Objective-C and you built an app with JavaScript, and it's really stupid. It's like, who cares, right? If you can build a good app in React Native, you can build a good app in React Native, you can build a good app natively, right? I think there are some things that'll be easier with one than others, but like that's technology, right? Like everything's got trade-offs and so, yeah, I every time I see that come up, I'm always like, I used to be like, well, maybe this really is the end for React Native. And what I've learned is like, no, it's just what people want to say. It's like a story people want to tell, right? So
everyone loves to see a framework they don't work on fail.
Yeah, it's so stupid, right?
Yeah, there's this thing like Angular versus React as well. And like that, it's not a real thing.
Well, yeah. Well, the other thing is like, I mean, I'm pretty involved in several communities, including like the Ruby community, right? Which, Ruby has not been the hot new technology for quite a while. And people are like, well, is it dead? And it's like, no, the community is growing, right? You go to the conference and there are more new developers there doing Ruby than there were last year. And the difference is that because people aren't talking about it, because it's not growing as fast as Vue or Express or whatever, right? Whatever the thing is that's getting its resurgence right now, people are like, well, it must be dying. And
yeah, and that's actually
not so much.
I mean, look at Python, right? Like Python's not been cool for a decade or two, but it's still like huge.
But people wanted their math libraries for the AI stuff and the blockchain stuff, and all of a sudden it's for data science, like Python's kind of having its moment right now. Yep. We're starting a machine learning show, by the way.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's one of the things. Like now we're really off React Native, but I've always been a Python developer. Our backend's all in Python. And then I got into like machine learning stuff a couple of years ago, and it was so nice to it was like all like Python is the thing that people have kind of settled on in a lot of cases for machine learning, which is great. But yeah, I don't understand. I don't know. It's now we're going to get philosophical, but I think you see this same stuff in every walk of human life, is like people wanting to like build tribes and tear other things down and stuff like this. And like, I think becoming a good technologist, becoming a good engineer is like kind of stepping above that stuff a little bit and kind of being able to look at these things objectively and realize like what tools are right for the right time and the right team and the right objectives and costs, right? And not just get so religious about it, right? But I mean, yeah, that's why you look at Revenue Cat and like, well, we'll do it. We'll do it. You got a whatever whiz bang framework? Yeah, we'll build an SDK for that. Sure, as long as we got the time and you've got the money,
yeah,
we'll build it.
I think a lot of people too get caught up in having made the smartest or right or best decision, without realizing that the smartest, right, or best decision was just to start, just to go, right?
Yeah,
found something that would work, and I started building it. And if you get a couple weeks head start, that may be the difference between it, rather than, I picked React Native over Xamarin or Flutter or something else.
Oh, Xamarin. We don't have a Xamarin SDK. That's one that people ask for, and we've yet to really have to do. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
On the topic of building an SDK too, this is super interesting because I've never built an SDK. I don't know what that means in terms of like how much work you have to do or how you get npm install to work for your specific thing. All these things to me are things that I use these SDKs and stuff, but I haven't actually delivered one. So could you talk about some of the challenges or how you actually make that come together and deliver that to people who are just writing React Native code?
Yeah. So I will say that Facebook, or I guess whoever manages the developer experience for React Native, has spent a lot more time thinking about the app developers than they have the SDK developers.
Right.
The experience for SDK developers is it's good. Like it's all there, but like the actual like flow is pretty rough. And so like, the way it works, they have this all documented, but they're called native modules. And they basically, the React core provides two ways of pulling in either Java code, bridging into Java, or bridging into Objective-C. Not Swift, Objective-C. And so what you have to do is you have to build a module that knows how to speak to these like special like compile, like they inject Facebook or whatever. Sorry, the React Native, the React modules inject some special like hooks and stuff that like, hey, if you call this, like we'll call to this native module by this name, right? And then vice versa, there's like a way to like hook back into the JavaScript environment. And we call these bridges. I don't know if they call them bridges, but basically you have a bridge file for Android and you have a bridge file for iOS. And then on the React Native side, you have the JavaScript code that faces the React Native app, right? And that looks like JavaScript. And so you want to write that to look as much JavaScript-y, platform independent as possible. Then on the back end of that, you have to have like two files that where you basically have an if Android, if iOS, like if Android talk to these modules, if Android or if the other one talk to these modules, right? That's not so hard. The hard part is, the actual hard part is just the like workflow of all that. So like, the easy case is if the Android and iOS code you're working on is frozen, like you have a release done and you can just pull those modules in to the framework, pull those frameworks into the like NPM code or NPM module and just like save them. So the native code is there. And then you can just work on the JavaScript. The problem is there's a few things. One is that, and this is just like, it's not called, not NPM. What's the, I can't think of it.
Yarn?
What's the build tool that,
Webpack?
Metro. So there's this issue where Metro, like Metro won't let you symlink to an NPM module. So like if you're working on an NPM module, you have to work on it in your NPM, in your node modules folder, in your app. So, okay, that's fine. So like when we're working on our SDK, we have this like test app, because it's ultimately you need like a test app to be, when you're building an SDK, that's really, you need some sort of app to like harness and like to manipulate your SDK, right? And so you end up working inside your node modules folder, which is terrifying, because what happens is like you're doing a bunch of changes in there. Maybe even you have a Git repo in there. And then of course, like throughout the day, you forget what's going on. You do npm install and poof, blows the whole thing up and it's gone. That's happened. We've lost days of work that way. I have. Caesar, our SDK engineer, has as well. So that's one really big like wart in the experience. Is like there's no way to work on an SDK while it's embedded in an app safely. So you have to. So yeah, you either, what we end up doing now, this is really janky, but we have like a standalone directory that is our module, like we just the Git repo for it checked out. And then we have our app as a whole separate thing. And then we run this like rsync script so that when you edit it in the one side, it copies it over into the app so you can run. So that's one of those things that like should just be considered, right? Like as part of the React Native experience, you should be able to work on frameworks easily. But that took us a long time to figure out, like, how do we do this quickly? How do we do this like without making mistakes? But, you know, I don't know. I don't blame them. It's how many people are working on cross-platform SDKs? You know, probably 1 in 100 React Native developers or something like that. So like, I don't blame them for not thinking too much about that experience. But yeah, that's one of the challenges. And then of course there's just, you know, it's always difficult to bring like 3 distinct code bases together and have it all work, right? So you've got the iOS and it's got a version number, and you've got Android modules and it's got a version number. And then you're working on the React Native code, and you know, like you can call into a method and it might go to Android or iOS, and like unless the behavior of those is like exactly the same, you might have issues, right? As it comes back, like something that works on one platform doesn't work on the other. So like you have to like consider that as well. I mean, these are all things that if you're writing native modules, you know, if you're like a React Native core developer or something, this is things you have to consider. But you know, for third-party SDK developers too, like, yeah, it's sometimes a lot of work, right? But you know, when you think of why React Native is valuable, right, it's because of this elbow grease that the core developers put in, right, to bring these two platforms together. And ideally create leverage for all the React Native developers downstream who can, you know, build cross-platform apps really quickly because of all this work we've done up front. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, things might have changed. I haven't probably built our React Native SDK in a year. So maybe somebody on there's like screaming at the podcast right now, being like, no, it's all better now. But, that's how it was at least like a year ago.
How much code gets shared between the native iOS and Android purchase SDK over to the React Native purchase SDK? I
mean, so really like none.
Wow.
I mean, well, because like there's the Objective-C SDK and then Java. So those we consult a lot. We like look at one and the other, and we try to like make sure that the code, the Java, and I guess most of it's Kotlin actually now. But
I mean by like the iOS one, like the iOS purchase SDK.
Mm-hmm.
So like let's say a new bug comes out, or let's say Swift or a new version of something gets updated in the iOS SDK, and you have to on the next version you have to update it on the iOS SDK, and then you have to do it as well as the React Native. Is the workflow pretty straightforward and easy, or is it kind of like complex?
It depends. So like if it's something small that doesn't really change the behavior or the API, sometimes we can just bump the native code. And as long as the calls we're making didn't change, like let's say it's usually not like iOS changes something. It's usually like we find a bug or like we find some issue that we fix. Yeah, as long as it doesn't change the React Native SDK, sometimes it's literally just replacing the .framework file and re-releasing the React Native SDK. That's the dream. That's actually probably most of our releases. And then it's usually when we add new features that we have to actually go into the React Native SDK and do some work and change some APIs and things, which tends to be a little trickier just because of, there's also like one of my gripes with JavaScript in general. TypeScript makes it a little bit better. Is like, it's really hard when we make, as an SDK developer, when you make a change, you really want, if that change changes behavior and the end developer needs to do something, you really want that to break, right? When let's say I change it, let's say something changes, I have to change it in an API, and that's going to require you to at least think about it. I really need compilation to break, because if compilation doesn't break, you're just going to bump our SDK and ship. And then if something subtle changed, it's going to end up as a bug in production, right? Swift, Objective-C, even in Java, that's kind of easy to do because you can like change a method signature. You can like even change a type in a method signature, and that'll break compilation. And even we figured out some cool ways in Objective-C and Swift and stuff to actually add like little notes that are like, hey, this is broken. Go see this link because we changed this, and like now you have to do this instead. It's really hard to do that on React Native. Like if I change something, like there's almost nothing I can do to a method that will break it before runtime, right? Unless they're using TypeScript and stuff, but we can't rely on that, right? So like that's I think one of the big challenges as far as like, when we bump something, is trying to like make sure how do we bump this responsibly without like accidentally breaking a bunch of people's apps. So it's challenging.
One other thing that I'm wondering about with this is that you've got iOS, you've got Android, you've got Flutter, you've got Cordova, you've got React Native, you've got all of these SDKs. And so let's say that an update comes out, right? So how do you keep them all in sync?
Very carefully.
I mean, do you just go and release one at a time?
Yeah.
Or do you go update them all, and then it's like, all right, everybody gets it all at once?
So here's the nightmare scenario that has happened to us and continues to happen, and we still haven't. I would love suggestions if you guys have ideas. But so here's what happens a lot of times is like, we build a new feature on iOS, we love it, we ship it on Android, it's great. Okay, time to go put it in all the cross-platform SDKs. We get like maybe through like maybe we do Cordova first or something on. We get to React Native and we're like, this doesn't work, right? Or like, for some reason, we didn't think about what this was going to look like in React Native, or there's like a weird bug or something like that. And then we have to go all the way back. It's like you have to go all the way back to the beginning. You have to fix it in the native SDK, and you have to start the whole process over again. That's been something we still struggled with, right? And when you're talking about a team, like we don't have a Cordova engineer and a React Native engineer, and we have 2 people working on the SDK right now, which is double what we had 4 months ago, which is amazing, but still. So it still takes us a lot of time, and we've tried to figure out automations and stuff like that, but all of these frameworks, like the release process is so different. And things change so fast. Like we haven't found a good way to like build an automation, because like I said, like you really do kind of want to think about every change that goes in. You kind of need to think about it in the context of that SDK, specifically, like you want to like we need an engineer to be thinking about, okay, we added this thing on iOS and Android. How does this actually work with React Native? What are the actual implications of bringing it together? One thing that we've done in the last, and credit to Caesar on our team for this, but one thing we've done in the last couple months was actually start sharing some of the JavaScript code. So like Cordova is JavaScript driven, React Native, I think Unity as well that's C#. Never mind. Don't listen to me there. But we have a couple of these cross-platform SDKs that are JavaScript driven. So we've actually kind of pulled together some of the common stuff into a shared repo that we can have some leverage as far as like updating all this stuff. But no, it's still very manual and still really tough. But I don't know. It's just one of the things. That's why people pay for us, right? Like we do that hard work for you, and then ideally it just works at the end of the day.
I'm also curious how the what the testing story looks like for those things, right? I mean, you put them through CI or something, but then you've got this back end, and I don't know if there's like a sandbox system that you can run the test payments through or something like that to see if it works, or if Apple or Google just kind of have you sitting out there, you stub it out, and then you pray that the back end integration actually works as planned.
Yeah, I mean, there is a sandbox environment. So this is like a more general in-app purchase thing. But Android, iOS, they both have these like sandbox. It's called sandbox on iOS, and I don't even know what they call it on Android. But basically, you can make test purchases that don't get charged and have like accelerated renewal rates and things like this. Problem for us is like you can't automate a lot of that stuff, at least on iOS specifically, because there are some automation tools for iOS, but they're very locked down so that you can't UI script anything that's not an app that you've signed on iOS. So, and the problem is that the in-app purchase modals are actually presented by the system. So they're not owned by your process. So you can't actually automate them, which is just annoying. So right now it's completely like a manual. I mean, we have automated tests, we have unit tests, and we test everything we can automatically. But before we ship everything, we still have to like pull up and do a manual smoke test of all these SDKs. That's something that I think we need to focus on this coming year, is figuring out how to scale that, how to do that better. I would love if we could actually automate it like fully, but yeah, it's a lot of work. I mean, I think that's true. I imagine most React Native developers probably don't have the opportunity to test on both platforms before shipping, or maybe they do. It probably depends on the sophistication of the operation, I guess, but it's a lot of work.
Are you stuck at home climbing the walls when you should be hanging out with the community at the latest conference to get canceled? Are you wondering where to hear your JavaScript heroes like Amy Knight and Douglas Crockford and Chris Heilman? After the cancellations, I decided to put on a JavaScript conference for you, online. I invited my favorite folks from around the web and got them to come speak at an online event just for you. Go to jsremoteconf.com and check out our speakers and schedule. The conference is on May 14th and 15th. The call for proposals is open until March 31st. Come join us at an online conference that we guarantee will keep you safe and keep you informed. jsremoteconf.com.
At a big company, I guess you would probably have part of your QA would be to hit iOS and Android, right? Especially if you were shipping on both. But yeah, it's a lot of work.
So one other thing that I'm kind of curious on, just because we're kind of getting toward the end of our time, is can you like boil it down to like 1 to 3, maybe 5 things that people should just keep in mind as they're setting up subscriptions, and then 1 to 5 things that are just kind of the easy wins again for doing this kind of a native extension?
Yeah. Okay. So for doing subscriptions, I would simply just keep it simple to start. Like don't try to build some really complicated productization where you have many different, you have like an intro period and trying to do referrals and all that stuff. Like start with a monthly subscription for $4.99 or whatever, like your MVP of your subscription experiences. And I'll also say that for like the productization in general, monetization in general, the app, like especially if you're launching an app, like, and you don't have a user base, you don't have anything yet, like focus on getting your app out, throw the monetization in there just to have it. But you're going to learn a ton about what people find valuable, what your conversion rates are. And then once you have like actual data, then start iterating. I mean, it's one thing at Revenue Cat, like when we launched the beta SDK, like I stopped product development for like 2 months while I waited for a few apps to go through the process before I had actual data from users, before I could like start seeing what the next most valuable things to build were. And that was really useful. I think that's on the business side, really, really important. From the implementation side on subscriptions, I don't think you need to have a backend right away. Like you can get away with doing it just on the client. But what I will say is save those receipt tokens. So maybe you're not reading them now, maybe you're not validating them now. But if you don't send those to Firebase, if you don't get those off the device, you might end up in a situation where you have a bunch of unrecoverable data in the future, and you're kind of you don't have any options. So I would make sure to like, get if you don't do anything else, get the receipt file off the device and store it in S3, store it in a database, just get it off there. Because those are going to be the data. That's the data you're going to need to do anything sophisticated down the road if you choose to. You might not need to, or might not want to, but it's better to have it than to not have it. And then for the SDK developers for people building native modules on React Native, let me see if I think it's called. I can find it and send it later, but do the file copy trick. I think if you Google around, there's a lot of people who have figured out how to do this, but don't work on your SDK inside node modules. That's my first tip, because you will lose it. That's the only tip I have. The rest of it's just pure grit. You just got to grind it out. I encourage. I hope there's more of a native modules community out there for React Native, because I think they are really valuable. A friend of mine runs a really big app on React Native, and he is always like, he's got to support Android and iOS, and he's always like trying to find good quality cross-platform modules for even simple stuff like microphones and audio. And simple stuff like maps. I guess maps aren't simple, but the more of these functions that there's and it's kind of a shame that I think this is one of the knocks on React Native, is that there isn't like a de facto, if you're building an iOS app, you use maps, right? Or you use core location, right? You have like one framework that's the one you use, right? And I think it's React Native kind of like doesn't have that necessarily. But as long as the ecosystem keeps growing, people need to build. There needs to be a de facto library for location. There needs to be a de facto library for audio. And there might be, I'm not super knowledgeable on what there is and isn't. But the sooner I think React Native gets there, I think that's going to like unlock more growth, and, it'll be taken more seriously, and it'll just keep going and going and going. Right. So those are my tips, I guess. Don't listen to me though. What do I know?
Well, when it comes to subscriptions and when it comes to building native extensions, I mean, you've got way more experience than I do. So, I'll step up to where you are, and then I'll figure things out from there, right?
Hit me up on Twitter, and I'll point you at our engineers that actually build stuff these days. I'm just going off of like my experience.
That's helpful. How do people find you on Twitter?
It's at Eiting, Jeiting is my handle. I can say some of it will be about computers. Some of it will be just obnoxious musings. But yeah, I'd love to hear from people there. Like if you want to at me or DM me and stuff, I'm always scrolling. So and open to conversation.
All right. Anything else, gang, that we should ask before we do picks?
So I'm super interested in the entrepreneurial side of things that you were talking about earlier. And one of the things you said was $2.99 for subscription. That just isn't enough. And that got me to thinking, you must have some idea on average sale numbers in that case for an app. And from there, what kind of numbers do you need to be putting through? What does a successful app look like? And are the days of one developer making $1 million from their app, are those days gone, or is that still out there, do you think?
I will say those are still out there because I've seen it. So that still exists.
That's good, because that's my entire retirement plan. So that is good.
Well, I'll tell you this, it's become a different game. It used to be the $1 million app developer could just build a great app and it would just get picked up by Apple and you would win, right? Yeah. Now, to make that happen with any sort of predictability, you need to be probably more of a marketer than you are an app developer. So the people I've seen successfully do that, the 1-2 person shops that I've seen pull that kind of stuff off. And I'm not saying $1 million, like they can maybe push like $50K a month, $100K a month on an app. They get really good at user acquisition. They learn how to use like Instagram ads really well. They learn how to do price experiments and price testing really well. Those are the kind of things that they learn, like what's the perfect trial period, what's the perfect communications. It's a lot of marketing now. It can still be done, certainly, but I think I mean, it just as markets evolve, right? I think you just have to get more and more sophisticated. There are still stories of like some somebody who just builds an amazing app and they luck out and it goes crazy. But even those I look at Marco Arment and his apps, like I think he switched to subscription because even he's got a huge audience, right? Even he's like, hey, I've got to do subscriptions on this stuff to really make it work long term, right? And so yeah, I think it's in some ways gotten harder, but it's definitely still possible. As far as like the reason I say like $299 a year or whatever, there are some just data points with just the math does not pencil out, right? Like you're just like, okay, like how many subscriptions am I going to have to sell? What's the average churn rate? Like all those things, you're like, I'll never make more than $600 a month or something on this, which might be fine depending on what which might be okay depending on what your goals are, right? Cool. But there tends to be kind of a right price for every app, and finding that I think is an important part of the journey these days to becoming but I will agree in the sense that I see more and more of the really successful operations, the apps that are really big, they're teams and they're a lot of times heavily marketing oriented teams. They really know how to scale and grow an app.
It's competitive out there at the moment for sure.
Yeah. I mean, having a good app will get you somewhere, but to really scale it, you're going to have to learn how to basically do paid acquisition in a scalable way, which is a whole industry, right?
That's cool. Thank you.
All right, let's go ahead and do some picks. Tim, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yeah, let's do it. I actually have 2 picks this week. The first is a podcast. It's by someone named Zachtronics, and this is just called the Zachtronics Podcast. He's an indie developer who makes games most of the time. He makes some really interesting stuff like Space Chem or Opus Magnum. But like lately, his most recent podcast episode was about Windows Media Player skins from the early 2000s. Which I don't know if you guys are familiar with those, but they were like, you could have your Windows Media Player, like, back when you're running like XP, and you'd have these gaudy, awful, over the top skins on them. And they're just ridiculous. But looking back on them, they're kind of endearing now. They kind of have a style that you just don't find anymore. So anyways, this podcast kind of covers the graphic design studio in this particular episode that worked on those. And it's super interesting. It's such a throwback. My other pick is a album by the cousin of one of our team members over at Activision. His name is BZ. He recently put out an EP called Better Late Than Never. Just a small warning, there is some explicit language in the EP. But it has like kind of like a wavy, soulful vibe going on in it. And I think he's kind of like a smaller artist. So it's definitely like, it kind of blew me away how good it was for how small of an artist he is. So definitely check that out if you're into kind of like hip hop, soulful music.
I'm going to listen to it on my skinned Winamp, or my skinned Windows Media Player.
There you go. Nice. Combine.
I think we did an episode a while back. I think it was on, I don't remember if it was Views on View or React Roundup, but yeah, somebody did a Winamp, skinnable Winamp in one of the frameworks.
I was definitely more of a Winamp skinner than a Windows Media Player guy, but I definitely grew up in that era of having the cool skins.
Awesome. Yeah. I think we should bring them back.
It's true. There's like this the extreme artistic skeuomorphism era should have a comeback, I feel like.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I also just love the fact that the capabilities are out there for smaller folks, like smaller and smaller folks, even with podcasting, for example, to go start their own thing and actually put something out that is high quality. I mean, that's becoming such an awesome thing out there. I mean, this guy may have done it in his house with, some sound foam up, a decent mic, and, a decent audio setup in his own home. I mean, that's becoming more of a thing, and that's exciting too. So, James, do you want to do picks next?
Yeah, sure. My pick this week is sourdough bread. And the whole internet's been making it. It's everywhere at the moment, but I've been doing it since before we were in lockdown. And I would like to recommend a guy called Patrick Ryan, who is an Irish baker. And he's got an entire masterclass online about how to make sourdough from scratch. It's super easy to follow. It's really nice. And anybody who is trapped in the house and or can't get bread, this is the way to do it. I love making this stuff and it is absolutely delicious.
Oh, that's funny. My wife has actually been baking a lot recently since we've been like shut in here.
There's nothing else to do. Get on it.
I have to actually warm my sourdough starter up. I always do the Austin Powers with it. I like use it once and then I put it in the fridge for like a month at a time. But I was doing it before lockdown as well. And I ironically, I haven't done any baking once lockdown started. It's like the opposite. But I've been seeing everybody's doing way better bread than me on Twitter right now. And I'm like super embarrassed. I don't even want to try anymore. I was like, everybody laughs me really fast. So
you're in the San Francisco area, right?
Yeah. I'm 2 blocks from the beach. So
you have to go within 6 feet of people to get the starter from somebody else if you don't have one.
You can the thing is you can start a starter without any contact. I think that's what most people, there's a misconception that you need like a seed or something, but no, just like
flour.
Yeah. There's yeast on your hands and stuff. Like
exactly.
Which is gross, but like cool.
I better not touch my face then. Don't want to get that yeast on it.
It's funny. I gave my mom some starter though. Like when I went back to Ohio the last time, I smuggled it. I have a daughter, a small daughter, and so I like smuggled it in her milk bottles. Like I put the sourdough starter into like the milk containers and brought it on the flight. Nobody asked anything about it because you're allowed to bring like extra volume if it's milk. So don't tell the TSA.
It's too late now.
They're gonna bust down my garage door.
Yeah. All right, Ricky, what are your picks?
Oh man, I think being in this lockdown, I've been playing a lot of video games. So I've been playing a lot of Warzone. I know it worked for them, but still, it's actually really addicting.
Nice. What is Warzone? I don't think I've heard of that one.
It's like a battle royale for Call of Duty, the new game.
Okay.
Pretty much.
The cool thing too is that it's actually free to play, so anyone can just hop into it.
What is it cross-platform? What platform do you play on?
I play on PlayStation, but it is cross-platform.
Is it good? I've always feel nervous about trying to play a shooter on console because like I grew up playing shooters on PC, and so I got used to the mouse, and I always feel frustrated when I'm like trying to do a shooter on a console.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm a PC person at heart, so like I kind of have to have the whole mouse experience when I play shooters.
The thing is that I don't have a gaming PC like set up, so like I just don't. But like I tried to play Fortnite a few years ago, and it was like, actually, it's probably not the mouse. It's probably just that I'm old now and I don't have the reaction time.
It's very relatable, yeah.
So old. So I'm gonna throw out a couple of picks. One of my picks is it's not really a pick, but it's a pick, is all of the COVID-19 memes that are going out across social media. I mean, that is the best part of this, is just people making fun of the situation or making fun of the people dealing with the situation or the people who are being really stupid about the situation. Anyway, it's been really, really interesting to watch. And so I've been enjoying those. I'm also just going to do a quick shout out. So I am putting on a React online meetup in April. And you can just go to devchat.tv/meetups to find that. Also doing a JavaScript one, but I think this episode goes out right around when those are. So you may just have to look and see when it's going to be. And then check out JS Remote Conf and React Native Remote Conf. And those will be at devchat.tv/conferences. And then I've been reading a book, and I don't remember if I picked this last week or not, so I'm going to pick it again. It is The Cash Flow Quadrant by Robert Kiyosaki. I'm really digging that. And it's been a really terrific read. So
yeah, his books are really good.
Yeah. I've had a few people point out some kind of controversy around his business practice, but the books are solid. So I don't know anything about the business practice stuff. So anyway,
yeah, me neither. It's a good entry point too for like a lot of young readers too. I think it was Rich Dad Poor Dad, just to get an understanding of like financial like advice or anything like that.
Yep. Yeah. It just gives you that foundation to think about, and then you can kind of build from there. So I haven't read all of his books. I've only read Rich Dad Poor Dad in this one. All right, Jacob, do you have some picks for us?
I do. I have a pick, and this one's going to come out of left field, I think. But is anybody like motorsports here, or like racing at all? Yeah.
I am.
F1. What's your sport?
I like GT3 and rally, but also some F1 as well.
So everything's canceled right now, right? There's no motorsports that I know of that are racing right now. But what's something really interesting that's happened is that a bunch of series have jumped onto online racing as a stopgap. F1 has been doing some stuff. I'm not sure IndyCar in the US, but the best one I think so far has been NASCAR has jumped on to iRacing, which is a sim racing platform. They brought almost all of the like star NASCAR drivers, a bunch of like stars from the past who don't race anymore. And they've actually been airing online races on Sunday in the normal slot on Fox. They've been airing these NASCAR races, and it's really wild because they have the real announcers from the TV slots doing the announcing. They're driving fake cars, but it unlocks a bunch of interesting things that they couldn't do in a normal race, which is like they can do interviews with drivers while they're driving, right? So like they're in the middle of the race and they're driving and they'll like jump in to talk to them, which you wouldn't do in a normal race, right? And there's just like angles and everybody's just having a good time. And, it's obviously not the same thing as watching real competition where there's real money on the line and all this stuff, but it's been really lighthearted. I found it just really entertaining. The racing, I think more than other esports, it's one of these esports that is almost identical to the real thing, Like if you watch Madden, watching Madden football is nothing like watching real football, or at least American football, right? And so like, but with racing, with e-racing, with sim racing, it's very similar. And so, yeah, I've been really blown away. I've been watching the last 2 weeks of this NASCAR racing, this fake NASCAR racing on Fox, and it's been pretty cool. So you should check it out. Just Google iRacing NASCAR. It's maybe a weird time to get into racing, but I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting to see how this affects the entire like esports ecosystem. Like I think my 50 plus year old dad is watching esports now, which is just a crazy thing, right? So anyway, that's my pick. NASCAR on iRacing.
Awesome. That's crazy cool. Do you do sim racing yourself? Have you got a rig?
Yeah, I do. I live in a tiny apartment, so it has to be a foldy one, but I do. And yeah, my wife and I are constantly fighting over the living room, whether it becomes my car or the living room. But yeah, I've been grateful to have sim racing like as something to do during the quarantine. But yeah.
I might be a little biased too, but it is. You actually mentioned like your 50-year-old dad or whatever watching esports and stuff, which is like, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like I've even seen stuff with like NBA games and stuff like this. Like people are now kind of like, I saw a coworker mention like, hey, if you put on like NBA 2K, I'm not really familiar with those games, it kind of feels like a real game. It kind of feels like, so like, it's kind of interesting watching like esports and video games really like kind of fill in some of like what's missing with sports right now.
Yeah. And I'll be interested to see for me is like how this continues, right? Like after this is over, like, whether or not esports kind of has its moment and maybe sticks a bit more in the mainstream than it was before. So yeah, we'll see.
Nice. Yeah. Now I have all kinds of other picks because it's like all the stuff that I've been doing in the quarantine.
You should start a quarantine podcast.
Oh, no, that's awesome. I totally should.
Devs in quarantine.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is not that different from like normal times, but
well, yeah, I work from home. The difference is my kids are here. So
yeah, same.
All right. Well, Jacob, if people want to get in touch with you, you already mentioned Twitter, but are there other good ways for people to check out who you are, what you're doing?
Yeah. Twitter's where I'm at day in, day out. It's a good place to get at me. RevenueCat.com. If you want help with subscriptions, we're always happy to help. I'm happy to sell you on the SDK or not, depending on what you need. But yeah, I'm on the internet. Come find me.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this one up, folks. And until next time, max out.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.